Good afternoon, Excellencies, honored delegates, ladies and gentlemen, and a warm welcome also to those of you joining online. I think this is the first event where we're starting early and not even on the dot, so appreciate your cooperation in that regard. On the outset, I should note that this event is live streamed and being recorded. The recording will become available in the coming days. My name is Sarah Rusopatowski. I'm a research assistant with UNIDIR, and I'm delighted to moderate today's panel on nuclear risk reduction from ideas to action. A large focus of UNIDIR's nuclear risk reduction workstream has been to try and get to a shared perception of nuclear risk and common approaches to risk reduction. To this end, we have engaged with officials and experts across the globe, from nuclear-armed states to non-nuclear weapon states. And we are really glad that we were able to gather here a great panel to take stock of different strands of work on reducing nuclear risks, both inside and outside the NPT review process. During the PrepCom and several side events, we have heard about some of these various initiatives, and today's panel is perhaps a chance to draw them in together, find synergies in the proposed risk reduction measures, and discuss how we truly go from ideas to action moving forward. As you can perhaps tell from the sheer amount of panelists here on the podium, there's a lot of interest and movement on nuclear risk reduction, and much for us to cover here in a mere hour and a half, plus 3 minutes. But before moving to our esteemed panel, I am very pleased to give the floor to Ambassador Julien Thöni, the permanent representative of Switzerland to the Conference on Disarmament and a co-organizer of this event, to provide some opening remarks. Ambassador, please, the floor is yours.
Yes. Thank you very much, Mrs. Facilitator. Excellencies, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, dear participants here in the room, but also online. So first, a very warm welcome from the Swiss side to all of you to this side event on nuclear risk reduction from ideas to action. I'm very pleased to open this side event alongside many of my esteemed colleagues sitting on the panel, but also here in the room. Switzerland has been working with UNIDIR for many years, closely and substantially on nuclear risk reduction. UNIDIR's ideas and convening powers have helped us formulate and advance both our thinkings, but also our contributions. And more generally, valuable work by various think tanks and academics, many of them also sitting in this room today, have helped to sharpen the understanding of nuclear risk, to create political visibility, to better made understood the need for action, and to outline necessary concrete measures to address and mitigate nuclear risks. Likewise, side events like today's are quite helpful in highlighting the ongoing different strands of works and initiative. I'm convinced the presentation and discussion of today's rich panel will complement the official deliberations and help to focus our efforts. In the run-up to the 10th NPT Review Conference, Switzerland has proposed a risk reduction package together with the Stockholm Initiative. It consists of declaratory elements, practical measures, and a political process. Since then, the need for risk reduction has not decreased. On the contrary, in the current deteriorating security environment, notably featured by the erosion of the nuclear disarmament and arms control architecture, avoiding escalation and also reducing nuclear risks is a matter of urgency. History has shown that the implementation of the NPT, in particular the implementation of disarmament commitments, plays a key role in gradually reducing the risks posed by nuclear weapons. This is best illustrated by the final outcomes of the 2000 and 2000 review conferences, and in particular by looking at Action 5 of the 2010 NPT Action Plan. And it is also clear that complete nuclear disarmament is the only guarantee that the risks posed by nuclear weapons are fully eliminated. It is therefore obvious to us that no dichotomy can and should be conceived between disarmament and nuclear risk reduction. And if, as we hope, a risk reduction package or another tangible product from the NPT cycle can emerge, and if this is to be broadly shouldered in the NPT by nuclear weapon states, but also non-nuclear weapon states alike, then this must also directly include traditional nuclear disarmament efforts. This should not be narrowly limited to strategic risk reduction. Listening to the intervention in the plenary room last week, I took note with satisfaction that an increasing number of delegations underlined the crucial need for risk reduction measures. Excellencies, colleagues, I'm deliberately also keeping my intervention short so that all speakers have enough time for their intervention. I would like to conclude my intervention by thanking the entire UNIDIR team and Andrei Baklitsky in particular for their high quality and politically valuable work. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Thöni, for keeping it short and sweet, and for setting the scene for our discussions today, and noting how critical it is to systematically develop ideas to test if they can be put into action, and also, of course, for Switzerland's continuous support for UNIDIR's nuclear risk reduction workstream. With this, I'm honored to give the floor to Ambassador Robert Inden-Bosch, the permanent representative of the Kingdom of the Netherlands to the Conference on Disarmament, to provide opening remarks. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that, and also a warm welcome to colleagues in the room, but also everybody online. Over the last couple of years, we have been discussing effective nuclear risk reduction measures, which we urgently need given the current climate of heightened tensions. And states have focused on discussing measures such as creating communication channels, promoting transparency on capabilities and arsenals, and dialogue about doctrines. These indeed provide a basis for concrete steps towards reducing the risks of war and reducing risks of the accidental detonation or launch of nuclear weapons. UNIDIR and other organizations and initiatives such as CENT, Creating the Environment for Nuclear Disarmament, are doing valuable work to keep this issue high on the agenda. At the same time, it's now high time to start implementation. Nuclear weapon states have discussed risk reduction measures, but not reached agreement, and this is most unfortunate. At the same time, there's enough research to get started, although unilaterally, also in this climate of geopolitical tensions. A good example of such a unilateral measure is increasing transparency. Running the risk here of sounding like a broken record, it's vital to create a climate of trust between states, but at the moment, trust is a scarce commodity. It's about in every speaking note I receive from my staff, but I have to repeat it here again. Risk reduction and transparency are our best shots, given the circumstances. And to prevent any misunderstanding, whilst we talk about risk reduction today, this is not a substitute for disarmament. However, any discussion on nuclear risk reduction cannot be separated from the realities of today's security environment. And the reality is the need for effective risk reduction measures is urgent. We face an increasingly complicated range of threats in the nuclear and security domain. And we are now dealing with multidimensional threats and potentially destabilizing technological developments. As we have discussed earlier last week during the side event of the European Leadership Network, emerging and disruptive technologies might impact the 3Cs, capabilities, communications, and credibility of nuclear deterrence and challenge classical nuclear deterrence. EDTs may also have a profound effect on capabilities, on military doctrines, declaratory policies, and nuclear postures. To conclude, I'd like to reiterate that the Netherlands warmly welcomes and supports the work done by UNIDIR. And let us also not forget that all states possessing nuclear weapons should take effective reduction measures, not just the P5 or N5. It therefore needs to be a discussion that is broader than the NPT. And I look forward to the presentations of the panelists and the responses from the audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Inden-Bosch, for joining us and also highlighting why our discussion on nuclear risk reduction is so pertinent. Before moving to our panelists, we have our final opening remarks speaker, and I will try not to butcher the name, Mr. Frederick Loka, First Secretary of the Permanent Mission of Norway. Norway has also been a great supporter of our work in UNIDIR, so it's great to have you here. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you for having me. And let me start by thanking UNIDIR and Switzerland for hosting this side event about risk reduction measures, which again has emerged as a central topic in NPT discussions and a topic that merits deeper examination, in our opinion. For Norway, supporting efforts to explore risk reduction measures and how these can be enforced is a priority in our nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation work. We are a proud supporter of UNIDIR. And UNIDIR has, over the last couple of years, produced a substantive body of work on risk reductions and on nuclear perceptions that have generated fresh ideas and new thinking that we as states parties can really draw from. So thank you for everything you're doing to address this important topic. On a more general note, let me say that Norway agrees that risk reduction can never be a substitute or a prerequisite for nuclear disarmament. We do, however, of course, see the importance and the utility of such measures in reducing current tensions and avoiding accidents, miscalculations, miscommunications, etc. And we do believe that we have to work on different fronts at the same time and focus both on the long-term primary goal of eliminating nuclear weapons, as well as the more short-term immediate goal of reducing risks. And for Norway, this means that we will continue our work to support Pillar 1, of course, of the NPT disarmament, and in particular, verification, irreversibility, as a way of preparing for the moment when nuclear disarmament is possible, while at the same time encouraging the implementation of risk reduction measures. We will continue to call for a strategic dialogue between the nuclear weapon states aimed at enhancing mutual understanding of current risks and also identifying measures that are practical and readily implementable. This is even more important now with the emergence and impact of new technologies such as artificial intelligence. This is not an issue that is likely to disappear anytime soon. It will probably become more and more relevant in the years to come. We see that more and more states are raising this issue in their interventions. And we are also gaining more knowledge and a better understanding of how these measures could be put into practice in today's security environment. Of course, this will require confidence building and a higher degree of mutual trust. And I guess we all have our parts to play in contributing to that. As a small country, neighboring a nuclear weapon state that has placed some of their nuclear arsenals just across our border, it is clearly in Norway's interest that such measures are in place, and I believe that would be the case for many other states as well. So I think I'll end on that note. I unfortunately have to run over to a Norwegian-led other side event about irreversibility, but thank you for having me and good luck with the discussions.
Yes, thank you. We do definitely have a... Is it on? Okay. We do definitely have good competition for today, so thank you very much for briefly stopping by and also for setting the tone for today's event. So with that, allow me to introduce our panelists, the main event, starting from my right side. We have Ambassador Michael Biantino, co-chair of Working Group 3 of Creating an Environment for Nuclear Disarmament, CEND for short. We then have Ms. Ann-Sophie Nilsson, Deputy Director General, Head of Department for Disarmament, Non-Proliferation and Export Control in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Sweden. Continuing to my left, we have Ambassador Shen Jian, the Permanent Representative of the People's Republic of China to the Conference on Disarmament. Next, we have Ambassador Lucy Duncan, the Permanent Representative of New Zealand to the United Nations and other international agencies in Geneva. And finally, we'll hear from my colleague, Mr. Andrei Beklitsky, Senior Researcher with UNIDIR's WMD program, who is leading the Nuclear Risk Reduction Workstream. So with that, allow me to proceed to Ambassador Michael Biantino to speak about some of the takeaways from Working Group 3 of CEND that concluded just this last May. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having invited me here to report on the substantive CEND work on nuclear risk reduction, which started in November in 2019 in Washington. At the end of this process, and in terms of deliverables, we were able to finalize a conclusions text in a meeting in Berlin in May 2024, which reflects the discussion of the views of the participants on nuclear risk reduction and should contribute to progress on nuclear risk reduction in general. However, it remains under the responsibility of Ambassador Jarmo Vienan from Finland and myself, and was not subject to a consensus procedure. It would go beyond the scope of today's discussion to elaborate in more detail all the rich discussions we had and the risk reduction measures we identified, including the specific risks they address. Therefore, and for future in-depth discussion of nuclear risk reduction measures, I would like to turn your attention to the more than 80 pages of text resulting from our work, reflecting the CEND discussion, and which are available on the internet. However, for today's discussions, some takeaways from what we did in CEND framework. Let me start with the politics of the CEND initiative. It is quite remarkable that at the outset all P5 and the three other nuclear possessor states decided to participate, and with the exception of Russia, remained active and engaged in the initiative. In addition, some very active and prominent TPNW countries and a mix of states, including other states relying on extended deterrence for their security, actively engaged in the discussion. This composition gave a very distinct character to the debate on nuclear risk reduction, since the topic was addressed from very different and sometimes diverging angles. However, in the discussion, wide areas of convergence emerged. In particular, as states aim to achieve a world free of nuclear weapons, it will be necessary to pursue interim measures to enhance security and reduce all risks associated with nuclear weapons and the likelihood of a nuclear weapons use, reflecting the urgency of the issue. Indeed, in the light of a deteriorating international security environment, including the continued or increased salience of nuclear weapons in the respective security policies, the re-emergence of great power strategic composition, the lack of progress in the pursuit of disarmament commitments and obligations, in particular as required by Article 6 of the NPT, disquieting trends of non-respect of international law, offensive nuclear rhetoric and behavior of certain political leaders intended for military coercion, intimidation, or blackmail, a perceived lower threshold for the use of nuclear weapons, i.e. non-strategic nuclear weapons, and the development and deployment of new offensive and defensive weapon systems, it became clear in our discussion that there is an urgent need to promote discussion on risks of nuclear weapons use between nuclear armed states and with non-nuclear armed states to foster understanding between diverging views. It became clear as well that nuclear risk reduction is not a substitute nor a prerequisite for nuclear disarmament, and that efforts in this area should contribute to forward movement related to nuclear disarmament commitments. As part of the CND discussion, all participants affirmed their commitment to non-proliferation and disarmament and underlined that the political will, especially among nuclear armed states, to agree or unilaterally decide and consequently implement nuclear risk reduction measures is essential. In addition, it was recognized that the role of non-nuclear armed states is vital and that they can contribute to nuclear risk reduction in meaningful ways. The CND discussion endeavored at taking stock of different types of nuclear risk reduction measures and identifying potential ways to address all nuclear risks, and in particular the risk of nuclear weapons use, as an important step to an improved international security environment and a world without nuclear weapons. In doing so, we undertook to identify in detail nuclear risk reduction measures in a systematic way, distinguishing in particular political doctrinal measures, i.e. commitments regarding decreasing the role of nuclear weapons in doctrines and security policies and limiting the circumstances under which these weapons may be used, e.g. no first use, non-use against non-nuclear armed states, strictly defense purposes, and including transparency on these measures. Secondly, strategic measures, changes in the deployment of nuclear weapons, including reductions, restrictions, and increased protection of nuclear weapons. Thirdly, operational measures, changes in the operational procedures, including launch, storage, and transport procedures, as well as commitments regarding detargeting and de-alerting of nuclear weapons and preventing unauthorized access to nuclear weapons and related materials, equipment, and technology. Confidence building and security measures as another step, increased dialogue, information exchange, and transparency regarding nuclear weapons, and last not least, crisis and conflict prevention and management measures, improving crisis and conflict prevention and management mechanisms, in particular communication challenges, in order to prevent any situation escalating towards potential nuclear levels. As I said at the outset, it would go beyond the scope of today's discussion to elaborate in more detail the very specific measures we identified, but I would suggest that they can serve as the basis for further in-depth discussion on nuclear risk reduction. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you. 80 pages might sound quite hefty, but I think the way it's divided, it makes it very accessible, and it's a good read, essentially. So with that, we'll now move on to Deputy Director General Ann-Sophie Nilsson to talk about the outcomes of the senior officials meeting in Stockholm and the risk reduction process behind it. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I also want to thank Switzerland and UNIDIR for hosting and inviting today's side event on nuclear risk reduction. And also it's good to see both, a strong panel here on the podium and many participants listening in. Looking forward to the engagement. And I think this is also, it shows the interest we all put in risk reduction. As was, Sweden has been engaged in the discussions on nuclear risk reduction for quite a while, and we know that there are ongoing discussions in different forums and groupings that have been referred to by colleagues such as the NPT, the CD, the SEND, NATO, and so on and so forth. And it was also an important feature of the Stockholm Initiative ever since we started our work in 2019, and was part of our proposals ahead of the review conference in 2022, both in the Stepping Stones working paper and then further developed in the working paper, a risk reduction package that Julien referred to. And I want to say, again, very much thanks to Switzerland for, within the Stockholm Initiative, have really been a main contributor to that work. And since, given the negative developments that we are witnessing around the world, Sweden believes that efforts to reduce the risk of nuclear weapons are more urgent than ever, and that continued strong attention should definitely be given to the topic. Not the least in the NPT context, but also wider. And therefore, we together with another group of interested states, both some nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states, we took an initiative a while ago to get together and see really what could be done now. We are how can we move this needle on risk reduction forward with an aim to try to moving towards finding convergence on what I would say possible concrete ideas within this realm of potential measures that we have been talking about for quite a while, really to see if we can go, as stated in today's title of the side event, from ideas to action. And we think it's very timely to put in an extra gear now when having the review conference coming closer, and it's only 2 years away. So this was the main reason why we wanted to, take such a discussion. And therefore, Sweden hosted a senior officials meeting in Stockholm on the 22nd and 23rd of May this year. We were 21 countries from different parts of the world that met and discussed how can we move ahead on reducing the risk for nuclear conflict. And the main aim, as I said, was to get a sense of first interest in a broader cross-regional group to work together, possibly producing some concrete proposals and recommendations ahead of the RevCon 2026. And we were at the meeting, as has been referred to by others, in agreement that risk reduction in no way replaces necessary efforts on disarmament. It has been said before, but it's really important to re-emphasize. But we also saw the need to move ahead where possible, especially in today's security environment, marked by high tensions and what we see irresponsible rhetoric, in parallel with the erosion of arms and the erosion of the arms control architecture. And apart from reducing the risk for nuclear conflict, risk reduction measures, as we know, could also enhance the level of confidence necessary for future disarmament. And it could be part of a useful process or a step on the way to future disarmament. I think this is something that should absolutely not be underestimated as a mean in the process. And another takeaway from that meeting was also that everyone can contribute. Nuclear weapon states, of course, bear a special responsibility, but also non-nuclear weapon states. We can work together on this, and I think that is an important takeaway and a message I would like also to bring up here. And we were, of course, at the meeting also well aware that there are different perspectives that surrounds the discussion, and we know that they might not always be easy to overcome. But I think it's important to keep in mind that if we could move towards some concrete measures as discussed, and if implemented, they can really make a difference. We had a few representatives from civil society and academia present, giving presentations at the meeting, and I think we can very much build. There has been very much good work, and I think your 80 pages within the SEND format shows that there has been so much work done, and that we should not try to reinvent the wheel, but really to work and build upon what has been conducted in very solid research. And also to continue within both the NPT community and broader, raise the level of understanding and awareness, but also what risk reduction measures could do in a positive way. And there, in that, if you do that, you would also, of course, increase interest and broaden the engagement. Another dimension that came up was also that you might, that risk reduction can also have different meaning at a regional level. And there might, you can also look at it both globally, but you can also look at, what have been the experiences in different regions, and how could you learn from them and take that further. So I think that is also a takeaway that I think is worthwhile discussing further and pursuing. And as I said, we are of course not, we really don't want to duplicate work, but I think that the different strands of work and the different discussions that are ongoing, they really can reinforce each other and complement each other. So I think that broad discussion as we are having, we should continue pursuing this. This group doesn't have a formal membership or a special, framework, but it was a way to start off a renewed discussion, and we want to continue. Also, we've done it this week here at the NPT. We also think that it could be worthwhile take forward in first committee and ahead of the next PrepCom to see what can be done. So we put together a draft plan that could guide our work, and hopefully one could, possibly build on potentially working paper at the next PrepCom, because I think, as I said early on, it's time really now to have the goal post on the review conference 2026 already now, if we want to achieve something there. So I think I'll stop there, and thank you so much for inviting us for this discussion once again. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, and noting that these different works on nuclear risk reduction should be complementary to one another. And that's perhaps also what we're trying to do today, just to kind of bring them in together to discuss. So with that, I will now turn to Ambassador Shen Jian to hear about Beijing's views on nuclear risk reduction, as well as how they are planned to be reflected in the China P5 chairmanship. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. And good afternoon, dear colleagues. I would also like to begin by thanking UNIDIR and the Swiss and Norway government for hosting this event and inviting me to be a panelist. In the current review cycle, the issue of nuclear risk reduction has received increasing attention, with various views and propositions put forward from different perspectives, as Ms. Nielsen just mentioned, including from Stockholm Initiative and NAC and various other group of countries and individual states. In this backdrop, as Sarah just set out in her remarks, this side event will help us enhance understanding of different ideas and perspectives and help brainstorm and explore realistic and feasible measures to reduce nuclear risks, as the title indicated, from ideas to action. We attach very much importance to the issue of nuclear risk reduction. China has submitted a working paper titled Nuclear Risk Reduction to the first PrepCon last year. I think it was the first working paper on this specific topic, which comprehensively elaborated China's views and perspectives on nuclear risk reduction. This year, we submitted another 2 working papers, respectively, on no first use of nuclear weapons and security assurances, which further build on the previous paper and elaborate some of the ideas from the previous working paper. I would like to take this opportunity to further highlight some of China's views on this issue. Firstly, a vision of common, comprehensive, cooperative, sustainable security should be upheld in reducing nuclear risks. This security concept is the important prerequisite for achieving nuclear risk reduction. History and reality have fully demonstrated that the world today is a community with shared future. The Cold War mentality, hegemony, and power politics, we believe that have no space. Upholding the concept of common security, abandoning the Cold War mentality, and pursuance of zero-sum games will truly achieve nuclear risk reduction. Secondly, we should identify and eliminate the origin of nuclear risks. It is a pity that certain countries obsessed with the Cold War mentality seeks absolute military advantage and has taken a series of moves that undermining global and regional strategic stability, which increase the risks of nuclear arms race and nuclear conflicts. For example, continuous strengthening of the role of nuclear weapons in the national security policies, tailoring nuclear deterrence strategies for other countries, comprehensively upgrading nuclear triad, seeking to forward deploy land-based intermediate-range missiles, building global anti-missile systems and other strategic forces, and strengthening nuclear sharing policy and extended deterrence arrangement. My colleagues have elaborated further during last week's conference meeting and side event on the implications to possible risks. I noticed that some countries appear for building the so-called guardrails. China does not deny the importance of setting up guardrails and managing crisis, but we believe that preventing crisis should take precedence over managing crisis. Eliminating the root causes of crisis is the fundamental solution. We firmly opposes the hypocritical practice of instigating confrontation and creating crisis on the one hand, while conversely calling for reducing nuclear risks and seeking the so-called guardrails to manage crisis on the other hand. Thirdly, it is imperative to immediately and effectively reduce the role of nuclear weapons in the national and collective military strategy as a measure to reduce nuclear risks. As UN Secretary-General Guterres appealed, I quote, nuclear weapon states must urgently agree that none of them will be the first to use nuclear weapons. As a matter of fact, none should use them in any circumstances. End of quote. No first use is the most effective measure to reduce nuclear risks. Nuclear weapon states should negotiate and conclude a treaty of or issue political statements on mutual no first use of nuclear weapons, which will effectively reduce reliance on nuclear weapon states and relevant non-nuclear weapon states on nuclear deterrence and the role of nuclear weapons in national and collective security policies, and thus fundamentally reduce the motivation for nuclear arms race and nuclear risks. China has submitted working papers detailing the relevant proposals, including encouraging the 5 nuclear weapon states to negotiate and conclude a treaty on mutual no first use of nuclear weapons or issue a political statement in this regard. We have submitted the document, which includes some of the elements for possible instrument or declaration. China noticed that the countries of the Group of Non-Alignment Movement and the NAC support the proposal of no first use, and we look forward to more discussions and support from member states. It should be emphasized that non-nuclear weapon states which participate in the arrangements of nuclear sharing or extended deterrence should also make relevant efforts and should not obstruct their nuclear weapon state allies from adopting no first use policy while hypocritically claiming itself the champion for promoting nuclear disarmament. Fourthly, the fundamental principles of maintaining strategic stability and undiminished security of all countries should be upheld. Nuclear forces, nuclear policies, and security environment vary greatly from among nuclear weapon states. There are no universally applicable nuclear risk reduction measures. Cooperation on reducing nuclear risks should be gradually promoted based on the level of strategic mutual trust among countries, and specific measures should be voluntarily negotiated by parties involved. Meanwhile, nuclear risk reduction measures cannot be substitute for nuclear disarmament efforts. States with the largest nuclear arsenals and most advanced ones should earnestly fulfill their special and primary responsibilities. We also need to be cautious that some countries attempt to shift the topic and shirk their responsibility for nuclear disarmament by advocating so-called nuclear risk reduction measures. As far as China is concerned, we are firmly committed to the path of peaceful development and a nuclear strategy of self-defense, and undertakes not to be the first to use nuclear weapons at any time, under any circumstances, and unconditionally not to use or threaten to use nuclear weapons against any non-nuclear weapon states or nuclear weapon-free zones. This is very consistent, very predictable, and in terms of the policy and intention, China is very transparent. We actively promote the joint statement among the N5 on preventing nuclear war and avoiding arms race in 2022. President Xi Jinping has also repeatedly pointed out that nuclear weapons cannot be used and nuclear war must not be fought. We will soon take over the coordinatorship of the N5 and is ready to continue to promote dialogue and cooperation among nuclear weapon states on reducing strategic risks and work together to strengthen the NPT regime. To conclude, I would like to emphasize that China has been, is, and will always be a staunch defender of international peace and security. We stand ready to work together with the international community to effectively reduce nuclear risks and contribute to actively to achieve the common security and lasting peace of world. I'll stop here. Thank you. I'm looking forward to further exchange in the Q&A session.
Thank you, Ambassador Shen, for illuminating us on Beijing's approach to nuclear risk reduction under the NPT auspices. And perhaps during the Q&A, you can hear a bit more about the plans for the chairmanship of the N5. It's now my honor to introduce Ambassador Lucy Duncan to speak about the working paper New Zealand submitted on behalf of the New Agenda Coalition to the PrepCom of this year, and specifically on implementation of nuclear disarmament obligations as a risk reduction measure. With that, Lee, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much to UNIDIR, to Switzerland for convening this panel and this side event, and very nice to see so many participants in the room and I'm sure online too. I've been asked to provide views on nuclear risk reduction as a member of the New Agenda Coalition. For those who aren't familiar, this is a group comprising Brazil, Ireland, Egypt, Mexico, New Zealand, and South Africa. We were formed 25 years ago in pursuit of more ambitious implementation of the Article 6 disarmament obligation in the NPT. I won't presume to speak on the group's behalf, but I can speak to what the NAC said in this PrepCom, both in its working paper and in the statements it has made. New Zealand was honoured to deliver these and to submit them since we are currently the NAC coordinator. I'm also going to offer a couple of additional New Zealand-centric thoughts. So the NAC view is that nuclear dangers have reached especially perilous levels and urgently need to be reduced. Our starting point is that the risk of nuclear weapons use, whether by decision or accident, will continue to exist for as long as nuclear weapons exist. And we must not forget that nuclear deterrence is posited on the very existence of nuclear risk. There is no safe level of risk, nor can risks ever really be managed away or controlled. The next working paper submitted to this PrepCom outlined some of the reasons, and by way of illustration, this included the inherent limitations and fallibility of human decision-making confidence and assessments. So any approach to prevent or manage such risks, whether called nuclear risk reduction or something else, needs to acknowledge this operating reality and proceed from this basis in order to be credible. In terms of this side event's focus, moving from ideas to action, NAC members in our working paper recommended concrete actions that should be taken to reduce levels of nuclear weapons danger, as well as concrete actions to contribute to strengthening the guardrails preventing nuclear escalation. In the interest of time, I won't list them all here, but share a few. And these include reaffirming the validity of existing obligations, condemning all nuclear threats, whether implicit or explicit, as illegitimate, inadmissible, and dangerous, issuing high-level political statements of nuclear constraint. A few others I'd like to highlight: the call on Russia and the United States, which still maintain nuclear weapons on high alert, to mutually agree to remove them from hair-trigger status with immediate effect. States to clearly acknowledge the catastrophic consequences of any nuclear weapons use and to support new cross-disciplinary scientific research. To call on nuclear weapon states to declassify historical information of instances of nuclear close calls. Assurances that nuclear weapons will not be used or their use threatened against non-nuclear weapon states under any circumstances. Doctrinal restraint, for example, no first use policies or defensive-only postures, and commitments to detarget and de-alert nuclear weapons. And I'd like to mention also the NAC papers is seeking commitments on the part of all nuclear weapon states to refrain from qualitative and quantitative nuclear buildups. So, as most of the panelists have said, and I think we all agree, none of these actions are substitutes for concrete disarmament actions. However, they could potentially stimulate progress towards fulfilling our obligations and commitments under Article 6, including as confidence-building measures. So further to those positions articulated by the New Agenda Coalition, New Zealand sees value in nuclear risk reduction measures as a contribution to reducing tensions, creating space for reaching common understandings and better managing crises, increasing confidence, and ultimately making progress on disarmament and arms control. However, as we said in our national statement, we must be alert to nuclear risk reduction activities supplanting nuclear disarmament measures. They're not the same thing, even if on the face of it they may look like it, and we should be mindful about this when we speak about risk. Given the catastrophic humanitarian consequences that nuclear weapons use presents, nuclear disarmament and the fulfillment of obligations and commitments under Article 6 of this treaty must be central. So we must take steps to reduce the numbers, the roles, and the salience of nuclear weapons with a view to their total elimination. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Ambassador Duncan, for sharing with us perspective from New Zealand and also on behalf of New Agenda Coalition on nuclear risk reduction. It's been really interesting thus far to hear some of the similarities, differences, and nuances between our panelists. So with that, we have our last speaker, but though by no means least, my colleague, Mr. Andrzej Weslicki, to discuss some of UNIDIR's research on risk reduction, and in particular, a bit more on the diverging views of the non-nuclear weapon states on this issue. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Saros, and thank you all to co-panelists for making the time to be with us today and giving very rich presentations, and to the audience, both in the room and online, for being here despite the strong competition. So our event is called Nuclear Risk Reduction from Ideas to Action, and this has always been the question of how you can get from great ideas, which we all have, to their practical implementation. As we have seen from today's presentation, a lot of work has already been done on those topics. But overall, there is a certain process of how you can get from this first part to the second part. There are certain processes of how you make a difference in the international fora. So first, you create a consensus among the majority or a large plurality of states over the specific issues being important. And it seems with nuclear risk reduction, we are moving in that direction. Second, you have to formulate a list of measures which the majority could stand behind. And third, use this momentum to push jointly for implementation of those measures, either in the existing forums or creating a new process. So on the first step, there is a feeling that nuclear risk reduction agenda is becoming mainstream in the NPT context and broader in multilateral diplomacy. Even compared with the first PrepCom last year, we had much more concerns over whether nuclear risk reduction agenda is something genuine and helpful, or a distraction from nuclear disarmament, or even an attempt to make nuclear weapons palpable, which must be resisted. This year, we had a number of working papers looking on the issue from different angles. Some of them we have heard about from my co-panelists, like the NAC paper and the Chinese paper from last year. But also we had already almost traditional working paper on measures to reduce the breadth of risk associated with nuclear weapons and measures to avoid increasing the risk. We had nuclear weapon-free zones as nuclear risk reduction measures by the member states of Treaty of Tlatelolco. And it's also mentioned in other papers like Stockholm Initiative Stepping Up Efforts in the national statements. It has been widely discussed in the P5 format. So this is coming from a really diverse group of states across the regional and ideological spectrum. And I would have to say this is a big success for the countries trying to bridge the existing divides. I will not be naming names, but you know who you are. And I think this reflects the recognition of the fact that nuclear risk and nuclear risk reduction is just another way to look at and to talk about nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons. And it does not have to belong to one group of states or experts. It's clearly not a substitute for nuclear disarmament or any other issue on the agenda. And if you look at the proposed nuclear risk reduction measures, my colleague Sarah Rus is doing research on this. a lot of those measures, specific measures, are not only compatible with, but in some cases identical to disarmament measures. There still remain issues, concerns, and disagreements, but there is a hope that we might escape dividing into camps and digging in, which unfortunately is too common nowadays on a lot of other issues on the agenda. So now we are kind of at this step 2, when we have to coalesce around a common agenda on nuclear risk reduction. And a lot has been said today about some specific measures, but I think here is where it's quite important to agree on what we're talking about. And in my point of view, talking about nuclear risks and nuclear risk reduction is the right framing, because it's the most broad term which can unite pretty much everybody interested in this agenda. Yes, there are other options like prevention of nuclear war, which we have in the CD, or reducing nuclear dangers. There's annual resolutions in the first committee, but risk reduction keeps it as broad as possible that everybody can find something they're interested in. And here's where research can give some ideas on what can be considered. So UNIDIR has commissioned an edited volume of essays from the experts from non-nuclear weapon states. And we have Mexico, South Africa, Zimbabwe, Jordan, Germany, Mongolia, Japan, and Singapore describing their perceptions of nuclear risks. We hope to publish it soon enough. And we also had a virtual event to discuss this topic among the authors and other experts. And some of the risks raised by representatives of the non-nuclear weapon states would be quite familiar in this audience, like the very existence of nuclear weapons, escalation between nuclear powers, nuclear proliferation, negative security assurances, especially regarding the nuclear weapon-free zones, but some very much closer to home. Things like the protection of nuclear power plants in the war zones. This is a very specific issue for the countries who have those nuclear power plants. Or even smuggling of nuclear material across national borders, or even security of nuclear waste deposits next to the country's borders, who can, leak in those countries and contaminate their soils. This doesn't sound like traditional nuclear risk reduction agenda or strategic risk reduction agenda, but this seems to be the issues which countries, especially countries in the global south, are really interested in. And I think having a broad discussion involving all of the relevant players and seeing what do they want to focus on, and then bringing all of this in one package, and then moving forward to push it through in various fora could be the most realistic way forward. Because as we know, as we've seen time and again, our formats are consensus-based and they are package-based. We had a great draft final document in 2022. Then once it wasn't adopted, there just isn't a good knowledge of what to do with documents, even if there is a consensus -1. You cannot just simply take bits and pieces and bring them in as a fora, because this is all glued together and held together by the consensus of all the parties. So without going too much further, I would end by saying that nuclear risk reduction agenda in its broadest sense, I think, has a very good potential. And there is a lot which can be done in this respect. And once we have this agreement on specific measures which could be consensual enough to move forward, then we can go ahead and implement them, and we can do it in various form, in different methods. We and UNIDIR are currently also working on research on all of the possible spectrum of how we can do this in nuclear disarmament machinery at the UN. But this is step 3. We're, I think, now in step 2. And I'm looking forward to the Q&A to see what more and how else we can move forward. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Andre, for sharing those insights. Also, perhaps what we don't always hear about different nuclear risks. So thank you for sharing that. And I think it's a good note to wrap up the presentations segment of this panel. Thank you for your extended attention. We had quite a hectic one. So with that, I would like to open the floor for questions from the room and online. So please raise your hand. I see Bill Potter. Anyone else? No? Okay, so let's start with Bill Potter. Maybe.
Thank you very much. I think you've set a record in terms of getting 9 speakers in under an hour, so it's a lesson in time management that maybe will filter over to the conference room. I thought one of the more interesting interventions this morning, and actually during the last 6 days, was by Mexico, where Thöni has reported on discussions that had taken place between the United States, Canada, Mexico, and other members of OPA with a focus on risk reduction. And I know, at least on the US side, it was led at the Assistant Secretary level. And so I'm kind of curious from the panelists, and maybe in particular Ambassador Duncan, since there's some parallels between OPA and Rarotonga in this regard, whether there are things in the works to perhaps try to replicate the meetings that were held this past April in New York, if I'm not mistaken. Because it seems to me that with a focus on a regional risk reduction, that's a way to move forward. And I believe there may have been discussions also about signing statements and interpretations as well as risk reduction. But I was curious whether, with respect to the Pacific, Africa, Central Asia, and other regions as well. So thank you very much.
Great. Anyone else from the room? Okay. Yes.
Boris Engelson, I'm a local journalist freelance. Mr. Michael Biantino referred to positive attitude of most countries except Russia. I think you said something.
But I can tell you what I said.
Okay, then in any case, I'm hinting at this phase of your talk because this is a quick question. Everybody agrees on peace and disarmament, but in the current phase, there is a special case which makes that even public opinion does not want or is not, let's say, enthusiastic about disarmament in any form. So could you elaborate on how and why Russia might have another logic and dynamics and how to cope with it?
There's no more questions. I'll just add my own third question. So to all our panelists, what do you think is currently missing from the nuclear risk reduction discussions? And I think it's especially interesting to hear from you after hearing from the rest of our panelists. I realize we have a question specifically for Ambassador Duncan and for Ambassador Biantino, but perhaps we'll go from reverse order and they will also address the questions specifically addressed to them. So Andre, would you mind?
Sure, thank you. And I think the importance of regional work, I will talk to this one, is obvious if we want to getting back to my idea of getting consensus for moving forward. You cannot get any consensus without actually going to the regions and talking to the people in the capitals or bringing them together in one place and listening to them, getting input with them. And I think it's really great that the United States and Mexico held this regional event in New York. Then is the question of will some other countries step up to do the same in their own regions, given again that there is still some concerns of whether this whole risk reduction agenda is something we need to go with. That's more to my governmental colleagues to respond, but I can say that we are closely following this issue and we are thinking of doing regional work of this kind with local partners to do exactly that. But then, of course, we are not a nation state, so having nation states on board would be even better.
Ambassador Lucy Duncan, do you have any comments?
Yes, I do. Thank you so much, Bill, for bringing this into the zone of the Pacific, because I do think it's highly relevant when we talk about nuclear risk reduction, including from an historical perspective. So, of course, in the Pacific, the legacy of nuclear testing is very strongly felt still. And one of the net proposals is that all states acknowledging the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of any use of nuclear weapons, including based on the history of nuclear testing, in itself, we believe, would be the type of confidence building measure that would contribute to reduction of risk. So there's a very clear historical and current Pacific dimension there. Secondly, the Pacific Island Forum, which is the central and primary architecture in the Pacific, has a strategy. It's called the Blue Pacific Strategy 2050. And so measures relating to peace and security in the region need to be developed aligned with that strategy and very much through the membership of the Pacific Island Forum, including its architecture. Of course, the Pacific Island Forum, which will be meeting soon at leaders level in Tonga, there are a number of dialogue partners. And of course, dialogue partners, including those who are nuclear weapon states, may choose to generate confidence and recognition of the Blue Pacific strategy in those dialogue conversations at any time. It doesn't need a special architecture. I think finally, the South Pacific Nuclear Free Zone, SPNFAS, the Treaty of Rarotonga, has protocols, and those protocols relate to negative security assurances. And New Zealand continues to encourage all relevant nuclear weapon states to ensure that they have ratified the protocols that assure the non-nuclear weapon states who are members of this treaty against the use or threat of use of nuclear weapons. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Duncan. Ambassador Shen.
Thank you, Sarah. And one point I forgot to mention is about the CND. We participated in the discussions of the CND. Unfortunately, we are not able to subscribe to the 80 pages, the outcome document, because we believe that some of our positions have not been duly reflected in the outcome document. I personally did not participate in that, but my colleagues participated. So we hope that that process in the future will be more inclusive and generate more consensus. Secondly, we had internally quite heated discussions in our on the issue of risk reduction. Recently, taking the opportunity, some of our experts coming from the capital, and some of the discussions are quite philosophic. And I believe what is missing in the current discussion probably is philosophy. And Chinese people would sometimes prefer to talk about philosophy. I just quote two quotations from some of Confucius and some one historian 2,000 years ago. And Confucius mentioned that 不知不孕. I don't know whether I can translate in true English, but the basic idea is though we repeatedly mentioned it cannot be understood by other people, by other countries, we will not be angry. Indeed, we have explained our logic, our narratives about risk reduction, emphasizing that reducing the role of nuclear weapons is a priority. I understand there are still some different opinions on that, and we will keep saying that we will not be frustrated, and we will continue to do that. So this is one quotation from Confucius 2,000 years ago. Another quotation is from a historian, Chinese historian 2,000 years ago. The quotation is 原始查宗. It's quite similar to what I mentioned just now. We need to identify the origin of the problem so as to predict and get better understanding what it will happen or the outcome of the process. So we believe that the origin of the increasing risks of nuclear risk is because of the mentality and perception, especially the doctrine of winning the nuclear war. Therefore, in order to reduce nuclear risks, there is fundamental need to reduce the role of nuclear weapons and to change the mentality that a nuclear war can be won. That is why we always emphasize, and our president and the leaders mentioned that nuclear war cannot be fought, and a nuclear war cannot be won and should not be fought. We need to have this mentality. We need to have this philosophy. And of course, in a broader sense, from geopolitical perspective, the idea of geopolitical competition that efforts to contain one country and to maintain hegemony is also the fundamental reason for such increased attention. That's why we always emphasize, as I refer to my opening remarks, that there is need for the vision of common security. So I would just stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Shen, for that. Deputy Director General Nelson.
Thank you very much. There was one thing I didn't mention in my intervention, and that was that I have been quite encouraged by the number of statements during this PrepCon. There's been many states that have brought up nuclear risk reduction as an important topic to continue working on. And I think that means that states parties see this both as an urgent need, but also as an opportunity. This is something you could actually move forward on. So I think that is important, and it's always important, as we know, that we have, political support and political backing when we try to move forward. So for me, you said, Andre, that this seems like risk reduction might be going into mainstream. If that is the case, that is definitely a good thing, and that we can take with us. At our meeting in Stockholm, as I mentioned, and has been brought up also as a question here, to maybe not go, top down, but also bottom up in a way of seeing, what would be a regional environment and what is needed there, and how could you learn from regional perspectives, from one region to another, I think is also something that we should continue exploring. So that gives me also confidence on that we can build on something. And then it's, of course, the measures that we have discussed about transparency, communication, restraint on doctrines, negative security assurances, arms control. There are many things within this grouping that one could test and try. Initiatives can also be taken, as I said, multilaterally, bilaterally, unilaterally. It depends on what states parties and not the least the nuclear weapon states sees as possible, and that we as non-nuclear weapon states can try to support that as much as we can. But I see these streams that are not new, but that can maybe reinvigorate. And I also think that we have not agreed, but we have had texts and measures that we discussed in 2022. Let's revisit them, and let's just try to move on some concrete measures, because I think that would also be the best indication of that this is an avenue worthwhile pursuing. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ambassador.
Thank you. Thank you so much. First of all, the direct question that was asked concerning CND, that gives me the opportunity to elaborate a little bit more on the working methods we had in the CND. We tried to, and we managed, I think, successfully, and that was one of the main reasons why we kept the process together for more than 4.5 years, is that we tried to create, or we managed to create a confidential space, a protected space where states parties could speak openly in a way, which is, I think, is extended Chatham House rules, I would say so, that was a non-attributed space where participants could come in, speak freely in an unscripted way, not fearing that that would be taken note and be published immediately. That's one of the reasons why I can't answer your question right now. It would be that you would have to direct it to the Russian Federation. The only thing I said was that all the states that started at the process remained active, but for Russian Federation. That's all I said. So I wanted to be clear on that. But concerning sort of a possible future for nuclear risk reduction, I think personally, and I think within the CND process, it became clear as well, nuclear risk reduction measures are on the agenda. They're important. They're not a substitute nor a prerequisite to nuclear disarmament. I think the political framing for any progress is very important, but the political framing is something we can do and we have done, and we've listened to the statements in the PrepCom, and I think there's a wide area on convergence on that, the political frame and framework for nuclear risk reduction measures. What's important right now from my perspective is to come to operational steps. I think it makes sense to distinguish processes and deliverables. I think in terms of processes, I mean, there are only two venues essentially which are open. That's the NPT, and that's why we're here. And I believe personally that the NPT is the prime forum for discussing and agreeing nuclear risk reduction measures. We have to realize as well that not all nuclear possessor states are here around the table. And so maybe we consider as well other avenues at a later stage or in parallel. Of course, then there's only the United Nations there. So I think we should seriously consider processes that are capable of producing results. The NPT has produced results in the past, and I think it can do in the future as well. The United Nations has done the same. I think in terms of processes, we should seriously consider how to operationally translate that into something where we can sit around the table and, first of all, talk and discuss nuclear risk reduction measures, and then at a later stage agree on nuclear risk reduction measures. In terms of deliverables, which is the second part of what we want to do, really, it's a bit more difficult. And there I would like to come back to the systematic way in which we try to address nuclear risk reduction measures in the CND process. We had political doctrinal measures, we had strategic measures, we had operational measures, we had confidence and security building measures, and we had crisis and conflict prevention measures. If I would like to start with the most difficult ones, these are the strategic measures and the operational measures. I think and this is Michael Biantino, this is my personal opinion here right now. I think operational and strategic measures in the current international security environment are very difficult. In the CND context, we agreed that all measures should be dealt equally and not prioritize measures. But we have to realize that some maybe at some point in history are more difficult to address than others. I think we should keep strategic measures and operational measures on the screen, but they might be more difficult than other measures. When it comes to political doctrinal measures, they're still relatively difficult, I think, because there are wide divergences in between non-use for defensive purposes only under extraordinary circumstances. But we have confidence and security building measures and crisis and conflict prevention measures. And I think they are not low-hanging fruits, because I think in nuclear disarmament in general and in nuclear risk reduction in particular, there are no low-hanging fruits. But here I think we can make step-by-step progress in agreeing on confidence and security building measures, which means dialogue, information exchange, transparency regarding nuclear weapons, for instance. And we could agree on crisis prevention and conflict management measures, which is in particular communication challenges in order to avoid escalating toward nuclear levels. And I think their progress can be made. So what I'm trying to say, I think we should get a clear idea on processes and a clear idea of what's realistic in terms of the deliverables. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ambassador Biantino. Very interesting, also the division between the processes and the deliverables. So I think that's a good note to also reopen the Q&A section. I think this is the last round, so speak now. So we have Reto, and then we'll go to the gentleman in the back and the lady afterwards.
Thank you very much, Reto from the Swiss delegation. And I think this has been a very rich panel, which showed that risk reduction is really a useful lens to approach NPT implementation. And there are a lot of good ideas for the way forward. And also good to see the focus on 2026 already. I think we would be at a very different place today if we had a type of language, as Andre referred to as pretty good language on risk reduction. We would be in a better shape now. But I think it's also, it's also showing a little bit that we have still a way to go and need to better understand concepts and terminologies. I think there were also some nuances in the presentations. And one thing that I think could be a first step is that the nuclear weapon states among themselves redouble efforts to get greater clarity about. Ambassador Shen has mentioned the origins, but then I think there's also perhaps different views on concepts, terminologies, etc. And I think in the past, the so-called P5 process has been quite useful, coming up with a glossary under Chinese presidency a few years ago to get clarity on what do we mean when we talk about nuclear disarmament concepts. Could not a similar type of discussion lead to greater clarity among the nuclear weapon states on these risk reduction centered concepts and terminologies? I wonder what the views are on the panel, perhaps particularly also from Ambassador Shenjian, who is now, of course, representing the incoming P5 coordination, be it on track 1 or on track 2 level. There's also always expert engagements possible among the P5 states to advance the shared understanding of what do we mean in terms of sources of risks and measures to address those risks, without saying like that's the way forward, but just understand each other better, what we mean by those proposals and where do the nuances lie. Thank you so much.
Hello, Andrei Shbalin, Counselor of Russian Mission. I would like just to respond to a question related to Russian position on CND and to the whole concept of risk reduction. I can tell you that we did take part in CND at the initial steps of this initiative, and we were not satisfied, especially with the method of works of this group, because we do believe that we needed to work on the premises of consensus, not on cherry picking of those initiatives and ideas that are suitable only for Western countries. That's why we proposed to modernize Working Group 2, Working Group 1, and unfortunately we were not heard. That's why we decided to withdraw our participation from this initiative. And as to our overall approach toward risk reduction, I can tell you that we are trying to to have a maximum level of risk reduction in respect to our relationship with the Western Troika, as it's called. That's why we are still having some agreements to pre-launch notification. We do support our hotlines, so on and so forth. But I can tell you sincerely that we can't go further to practical measures in this area, having in mind the principal position of the Western countries to impose strategic defeat on Russia, especially in Ukrainian crisis. And we do believe initially it was our position that to prevent nuclear war and to reduce nuclear risk, nuclear power, N5 should avoid any military confrontation, not only nuclear war, but any nuclear military confrontation, direct military confrontation. But we have seen from the first days of our reapproachment with NATO, as we were neglected, our national interests were neglected. And if you look at the presidential joint statement on 3rd of January 2002, you may mention, you may know that there is a very strong provision regarding respecting of national interests of each other and avoiding direct military confrontation. That's why we do believe that we need to take practical measures in this direction. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I see 3 more questions. There's the lady in the back, the gentleman in the front, and then the last lady, and then we'll open again to the panelists with also concluding remarks. Thank you.
It's on. Okay. Thank you very much. My name is Christine Housel. I'm representing the World Indigenous Association, and I'm also working with multilateral group think tank, which is working on digital diplomacy and other technical and ethical solutions to the emerging AI economy. And following the question about modernization, my question is, as we look toward future action, are there plans in place, or are there processes to develop plans that take into account the urgent need to address a risk around AI as well as opportunity and other emerging technologies? Also, a question about how much have you had connection with other processes going on in the United Nations? And is there an idea to connect into the Summit of the Future? Thank you.
Of course, I will welcome a perspective from the podium. There is a majority of consensus with regard to the concept of nuclear risk reduction. But I think the real of how to achieve that. The first reason is about the perception of risks. So I do not want to elaborate more on that. So that means the real challenge is that the most promising, the measures that have the most promising prospects to be agreed upon should be those measures that could be served to reduce risks that are commonly recognized as risks, rather than those risks rather than those measures that might, quote unquote, reduce risks for some, but increase risks for others. And the second point is about it is important to take into consideration of the original sources of the risks. We do not want to see a scenario that some country single-handedly created some risks and then demanded for a common solution by all of us. And we do not want to see a scenario that some countries might intentionally create some so-called manageable risks so that they could evade from the most relevant obligations, which I would say at this stage is still the further reduction of the still formidable nuclear arsenal of the world. The third point is that you need to take into consideration of the difference among.
It's now it's on.
You need to take into consideration of the differences among policies. I mean, the difference among policies and doctrine. For example, China, everyone's quite familiar with the Northwest use policy. For us, we do think that this is a huge step toward reducing the real risk, because this is effectively reduce the role. If every nuclear weapon state could make a solid commitment to that, that will effectively limit possibilities of use of nuclear weapons. And how do you reconcile the different perception of the policy and doctrines? I think that can be also challenging.
Thank you. If you could do your question in 20 seconds, that'd be great.
I will be very short. So my question is on the discrepancy or maybe the gap between measures, proposals, and options we have on risk reduction and the implementation. So to give 2 examples, dialogue would be great as a great risk reduction measure, but it doesn't really happen among the P5 or maybe bilaterally, although some nuclear weapon states offer it, others reject it. Another example is, here I would say, maybe irrespective of doctrines and policies, we see nuclear buildup instead of disarmament. So my question is how to address this gap between what we have on the table and implementing these measures. Thank you.
Great. Our panelists are going to have to answer very quickly in 2 minutes because we also have one online question, and I do want to give the floor to that question. So it's related to the issue of nuclear safety and security as a nuclear danger concerning the nuclear plant in Ukraine. Is there any legal cooperation framework under consideration for strengthening global nuclear safety and security in conflict zones? Really, each panelist 1-2 minutes, and we will wrap up. Thank you. Andre.
So I think the last question, there's something more to the Vienna people. That's what IAEA does, Department of Safety and Security, and I'm sure there is a lot of ongoing work, and Director General Grossi has it under his control. And to the question from our German colleague on the, I mean, it's complicated. We don't have any good question. Had we had any good question, we already probably will be doing that. But I think there are 2 possible ways on moving forward. One way, and again, as our Chinese colleague mentioned, we can try to find things where there is a consensus and do those things. And we've heard, for example, pre-launch notification example from our Russian colleagues. Kind of everybody wants to know when there is missile launches, so there wouldn't be overreaction or war starting accidentally. So we might look for more things like this where everybody is kind of in agreement and pursue those. But the second thing is something that I already mentioned. If there is a consensus or near consensus of the international community of what measures should be taken, then the international community could say, well, and a lot of those measures are based in or can be traced to, NPT, traced back to the SOD1, traced back to, First Committee and General Assembly resolutions, 2010 and 2000 UN final documents, so on and so forth. So if there is a consensus understanding, like this is what the world wants, and then all of the members of the global community could be asked to implement this number of measures, and if there's majority behind it, I think there could be some movement on that part. But those are 2 most realistic ways, in my view, how we can move forward. Again, we've seen international community wanting something and that's not happening. So even that is not a given, but I think this is where we might be going. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm going to limit myself just to a comment. So Reto from Switzerland encouraged a dialogue on concepts and terminologies amongst the 5 nuclear weapon states to clarify, make a contribution themselves to the further evolution of what are nuclear risk reduction measures that are well understood by them and us, and what can we do about it. So that seemed to me a very constructive next step. So I endorse it on a national level.
Thank you, and thank you for Richard's recommendations to the N5 process. Indeed, I personally participated in the discussions of the glossary. Previously, it was regarded as just the dictionary, what's the utility for the nuclear disarmament. But I do think such kind of exercise is very important for nuclear weapon states to understand each other, including the doctrines and specific definitions. As we are taking over the coordinatorship, we will listen carefully to the members of the nuclear weapon countries and take into consideration the comfortableness of each and every member of the group. We will not impose any agenda, and the focus is to implement, to strengthen the NPT regime and to enhance our trust and can carry out such kind of dialogue. It was mentioned that trust is a scarce commodity, and I personally also feel that dialogue is also very difficult to be arranged, especially under the current geopolitical situation. So it's not the same thing. We coordinate the N5 comparing with 10 years ago, 5 years ago. So we need to be patient and we need to listen carefully to all the members, including non-nuclear weapon states. After we've taken over, we will take into consideration the recommendations from the floor, and we will recommend to the capital to, and I believe that we will also carry out the exercise in transparent manner. As for the issue of the emerging technologies, indeed, it will have some implications. And on the artificial intelligence itself, we followed and participated in the UN process, and we believe that UN should play a role in this regard, and we support the efforts by the high-level advisory panel, and we look forward to the recommendations from that panel. And we also noticed the efforts by Netherlands and ROK for some exercise in the UN framework. And there are still differences. We hope that these countries will take into consideration the concerns raised by member states to make it an inclusive and consensus process. That will be very important. And finally, the issue of the modernization of build-up vis-à-vis the disarmament. Indeed, as I just mentioned in my remarks, it is very important to pursue, to honor the principle of strategic stability. This is very important. If the stability is broken, definitely we'll see escalation of tension. We will see efforts to build up, and everyone has the general understanding that we keep the strategic stability. It will facilitate further reductions, either the role of nuclear weapons as well as physically a reduction. I'll just stop here. Thank you.
With regards to the question about the Summit of the Future, from a Swedish perspective, we are of course very much engaged in those preparations, and I think that is very welcome if we can move forward there. But I still believe, also coming back to the discussions we have had within the NPT format for many years, and likewise today, I think the in-depth knowledge and experience is what we have within the NPT context. So I think this is the realistic place to move forward. And I would also like to, if we should come to concrete measures, and I would also like to, like others have done, highlight the need for continued transparency, because I think we need to have much more of that in order to understand where different states parties come from and how they follow through their rationale. And of course, to the extent we understand it's complicated, but and as Reto has said, an increased dialogue and exchange within the P5 or N5, I think is of course crucial to get going concretely. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I would like to come back to two questions from emerging technologies and from our Chinese colleague on perception of risk. Without divulging any secrets in the CND context, we're actually right now seriously considering to start working on emerging technologies in artificial intelligence as well, both from the point of view of the benefits that it could bring in terms of risk reduction in nuclear disarmament and arms control, and the challenges that might emanate or could emanate from artificial intelligence. I think there are two angles to it which we should seriously consider. I think there's a strong point to be made that artificial intelligence and emerging technologies are introducing instabilities and uncertainties into nuclear decision making, and therefore have to be seen in a critical way. On the other hand, you could argue that artificial intelligence and emerging technologies are increasing transparency and reliability on decision making. And so I think we have to seriously consider that, because from my perspective, we are just at the beginning of trying to understand what artificial intelligence and emerging technologies will have as results in the nuclear field. I don't think there are any given results yet. I don't think we can come to conclusions yet. I have to admit personally that I hardly understand what artificial intelligence is really, because we talk so much about it and we see some practical results, but when you come to the details, I find it very difficult. But this is just Michael Biotino. I might be the only one in the room here. But we're seriously considering these two issues in the CNT context to start considering, because I think they are important in terms of benefits and challenges in the nuclear field. The second point that was made by our Chinese colleague, I think it was very important. He said perception of risks. And I think in our discussion, we might want to distinguish perception of threats and risks, because these are two different things. The risks are something which are objective, perceptions are something which are subjective. And I think we might, once we finished our work on reduction of risks or perception of risk, we might come to a closer discussion of threats. What increases threats and what decreases threats? I think that's a discussion still to be carried out. We haven't had it yet. But I think the two things are different, not only from an analytical point as well, but as well from an operative point of view, because it might be easier to influence and to mitigate the risks. It might be more difficult to decrease and mitigate the threats. I think that's something to be had. And then you made a couple of other points, and therefore I only wanted to refer to two issues that were discussed in the CNE context as well, without having come to conclusions. This is the issue of transparency and verification concerning risk reduction measures. It is very good to agree on risk reduction measures, but if they're not verifiable in advance, they're very difficult to be relied on. And therefore, we have to take a very critical look at all the proposals. Are they transparent to all the rest of the world? And can they be verified in advance? I think this is a critical measure to evaluate the validity of any risk reduction measure. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So even though we started a few minutes early, we still went over time. So thank you again for everyone for your extended attention. Also, thank you for our panelists for allowing for such an interactive discussion. We got a lot of questions in, lots of answers in. So that also is due to our panelists being able to stick to 7 minutes, which is highly remarkable. I'd also like to thank my colleagues at UNIDIR, specifically Louisa and Ritanju, for all their support. And there should be a QR code to fill in any evaluation, any feedback you have. Also online, we shared a link. So yes, that's it for now. Thank you for joining us today and see you next time.